بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وبعد. So we're discussing the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire was obviously towards the west. So the main empire in the east were the Persians, in the west the Romans. And the Roman Empire, as we said, was split into the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. However, the Western Roman Empire was not really very significant in terms of world events, and the major power of the time was the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire. Now obviously the Byzantines, they were Christians, and so they took with them, wherever they went, they took their religion with them. And we will see as Islam spreads towards Sham and taking over large parts of the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire, of how their religiosity and their religion is shown in the battles that take place and the incidents that take place between the Muslims and the Christians in those areas and the Romans in those areas. Obviously their religion would differ from place to place, and also their religious personalities were not just limited to their churches or worship. In fact, their religion was a critical part of the state. A critical part of the state. The leader of the state, the emperor of Rome, he would have many religious advisors. He would be expected to be a religious man himself, or man of religion. There would be many monks who he would take advice from, and they would have priests accompanying them in all their journeys, in their battles, in their travels. So they were a very religious society in that sense. However, obviously they had gone very far from the teachings of Isa alayhi salam, and so they were believing in the Trinity. They were believing in that Isa alayhi salam is the son of God, etc. So many of these incorrect beliefs had already crept into the Roman Empire before the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And alongside that, they had started to revere those people who had passed within their empire, within their communities, and started taking their religion from their priests, even if it was to go against the teachings of Isa alayhi salam and their books. Which is why Allah Azza wa Jal in the Quran, He mentions that why do you take, regarding the Christians, that they took their priests and their scholars as gods alongside Allah. As gods alongside Allah. Now if somebody was to read the books of history, or somebody were to ask the Christians at the time that do you worship your priest? They will say no. They never used to worship the priest or bow down to the priests or their scholars. But Allah mentions that their worshipping was that they used to listen to the words of their priests and their scholars over the word of Allah and the word of His Prophet and what has been revealed. And that is a very important point and lesson for us to take as Muslims. That first of all is the message of Allah Azza wa Jal, the word of Allah Azza wa Jal, which is the Quran. Thereafter, and alongside it, the words of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his sunnah, his practices, and the hadith. And thereafter those that have come from the authentic ulama and the authentic salaf, and the authentic people of those who are the inheritors of the anbiya. However, if anyone was to come and give rulings or give any advice which goes against the Quran or against the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and against the consensus of the ummah and the scholars of the ummah, then this would be, and somebody was to follow. So if Allah Azza wa Jal has made, and we all know that interest and taking riba is haram in Islam. But if someone was to come and say that no, riba is permissible, then that person is going against the Quran, and a person was to follow that opinion and take that opinion into consideration, then he would be just like the Jews and Christians, which Allah mentions in the Quran, that they are taking their scholars or they're taking their priests as partners unto Allah. So this is what was the condition of the Roman Empire at the time. A lot of immorality had also spread within the Roman Empire, similar to the Persian Empire. And generally, this was the condition of the world whenever Allah Azza wa Jal sent a prophet, or a condition of the area wherein Allah Azza wa Jal sent the prophet. Now, as previous prophets came, they were sent to either their tribe or their nation, etc. They weren't sent to the world as a whole. Like Musa alayhi salam, Allah Azza wa Jal sent him to the Israelites. And Allah Azza wa Jal mentions this many a time in the Quran. Musa alayhi salam wasn't sent to the whole world. In fact, you will find many incidents where there was more than one prophet on earth at the same time. At the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam, there was another prophet. What was the prophet's name? Lut alayhi salam. Lut alayhi salam was there at the same time as Ibrahim alayhi salam, but they were in different areas. Lut alayhi salam was towards where we say? Which area? Which area was Lut alayhi salam? Towards Sham, towards Palestine. Yeah? And where was Ibrahim alayhi salam? Ibrahim alayhi salam was born in Iraq. And then he traveled like this towards the edge of Syria and towards Sham. And thereafter he traveled with his son towards Makkah. And thereafter traveled back to Iraq. So that was Ibrahim alayhi salam. So at the same time there were multiple prophets who Allah had sent onto earth in different regions and different places. But the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Allah Azza wa Jalla said regarding him, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا كَافَّةً لِلنَّاسِ بَشِيرًا وَنَذِيرًا. That the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam was sent to the whole of mankind. لِلنَّاسِ جَمِيعًا. In another verse Allah Azza wa Jalla says. So Allah Azza wa Jalla sent the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam to all of mankind. So, and the reason for that, as we can see, is that Allah Azza wa Jalla, when He sent it to each area, it was because in that certain area, in that locality, the people had turned away from Allah Azza wa Jalla. And the Prophet was sent to that location. Could have been at the same time, in another place, a Prophet was already there and the people were worshipping Allah. But the Prophet was not sent to this second nation, therefore they had a separate Prophet. Now the whole world at the time of the Prophet ﷺ had fallen into immorality and into shirk and ascribing partners with Allah and polytheism. Allah Azza wa Jalla sent the Prophet ﷺ to the whole of mankind. So the Roman Empire, especially the Eastern Roman Empire at the time, had spread, had taken over many parts of the Western world and had come towards the East. So Syria, Greece, Rome, their headquarters were in Constantinople, or modern day Istanbul. And this area is also very important in the history of Islam during the times of the Khulafa, al-Rashidun, the times of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali radiallahu anh, during the time of Muawiyah radiallahu anh. We will see how the Muslim rule was spreading. And yet Constantinople was not conquered until many, many years later. So the Roman Empire, even though it had become very weak, they were still holding on to a small remnant of the empire for almost 1,000 years. And there was a famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ giving glad tidings to that army of the Muslims which will conquer Constantinople. And so many Muslim rulers and many armies, they tried to conquer Constantinople before it was conquered, but they were unable to. Also, as we said, Egypt had previously been under the control of the Persians, but then the Romans, they conquered Egypt and drove the Persians out of Egypt and drove them towards the east, and therefore this whole area here that we can see, this is Egypt, Alexandria, this is Sinai, this is Al-Quds, so Bayt al-Maqdis is here, Jerusalem. This area here is northern Arabia, covering all the way through what we call now modern Jordan, to the southern Syria, this area here, and all the way up towards Turkey. And at the top there we can see is Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul. So this whole area was covered by the Romans. Now, if we're to look at this, this is a general map of the whole world in the year 600. So, before the prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ, by how many years? How many years? The Prophet ﷺ was born in 570. 10 years, yes. So the Prophet ﷺ received prophethood at the age of 40. So this is in 600, therefore it's 10 years before the prophethood of the Prophet ﷺ. So if you have a quick look at the other empires which are in this region, or the other countries which existed at the time. So if you look on this side, this is the Persian Empire, which we have covered. And the Persian Empire had also taken over this area here, which was called the Lakhmids. This is northern Arabia, Iraq. So Iraq is in this area here, the northern part. This area here is Iraq. As you go down, this area here was Bahrain, going towards this area here, which was Oman, and which is Oman in the current day also. The Romans are all the way from Europe, throughout Turkey, Eastern Europe, conquering all the way until the borders of the Persian Empire, and then they go down into Africa. In fact, they were controlling a large part of the coast of Africa also. So these are the Romans and the Persians. Now, who else were significant at the time? The two other major players of the time was the Indian Empire and the Chinese Empire. So China is obviously towards this area, and India starts from here. Now the Indian Empire, or the Indian continent of the time, had split up into different Rajputs, or different areas, which they used to call them. So each area would have its own ruler, who used to rule each area. So if you can see from here that while the Persian Empire is one huge block, as the Romans are one huge block, here there are small states. And China also was split into small states at the time, and it had lost any power that it had before. Previous to it being split into states, the Indian area was actually controlled under one ruler, and they were also a force to be renowned at the time in the world, and they were also a very old community and settlements of humans in India. However, at this time, at the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, the area had become very weak. The Indians had become very weak. They had split up into different families, different rules in all the different areas. So Sindh was different, the Gurjara was different, the Valabi was different. So all the different areas were ruled by different families and different noble tribes. China was very similar. Previously, they used to have a central government. They again had split into different tribes, and each area was run by a different ruler. So they didn't really have much play on the international stage. Although the scholars had passed previously in China and in the Indian area also. Now towards the rest of the world, at the time, and as historians put it, this was the extent of the civilized world, that's it. So the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, the Persians, parts of India, and parts of China. The area we live in today, and Europe, it was not part of the civilized world. As we can see in the top leftmost corner, there are approximately more than 20 different states in the United Kingdom itself. And each area was ruled by a different conqueror, by a different family. There was always war going on between themselves. Whereas the Eastern Roman Empire, so the Byzantine Empire and the Persian Empire, were fighting over large areas of land of Egypt and going far across their borders. The people the tribes and the areas in the west of the world here, they were fighting over different small parts of land, just amongst themselves, within their own countries, within their own borders. And they had created even more borders within their own borders. So this area of the world, in fact, many historians have not even written much about, because it was not very significant at the time of the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. In Africa, again, very similar to Arabia. The situation in Africa was very similar to Arabia. Tribes with their own internal rules and regulations and rulings between themselves. A tribal leader would decide and make agreements with each other with regarding to any disputes. He would rule the disputes. He would be the leader of the tribe. Very similar to what it was in Arabia. But again, it wasn't split up and like the Western Europe was at the time. Now, the area which we obviously need to focus on at the advent of the Prophet ﷺ is Arabia itself. So again, if we look at this, this is Arabia. Now, Arabia is not Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a very recent country, very recent state. And it's named after the house of Saud. Named after the house of Saud. That's why it's called Saudi Arabia. The actual peninsula was called the Arabian Peninsula. And the Arabian Peninsula, as we can see here, was actually quite large. So it covered the whole of modern-day Yemen, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, which covers Dubai, etc., Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, all of these areas. Now, modern day, obviously, the smaller countries which you just mentioned of Kuwait, Qatar, all of these, they are all on the eastern coast. They're all small islands on the eastern coast. Bahrain at the time was basically covering a large part of the eastern coast, as we can see here. So this area here was all called Bahrain. Now these areas are significant geographically. Now, although history is slightly different to geography, but they tie in very close together, because without understanding geography, you can't really understand history. Because if tomorrow, when we start, and somebody says that they went from this region to this region, they took over this area, if we have no understanding of geography, we'll have no understanding of what is happening. If we don't understand the size of the location of each area, the locations, the names, what existed in that time, we won't have an appreciation of journeys traveled. We will have an appreciation of the areas that were covered. So it's very important for us to understand the geographical context of not just Arabia, but the whole world. That's why I went through the maps visibly went through the maps in this way. So if we look at Arabia for us, where we will start off with the birth of the Prophet ﷺ and the first years of Islam. So we have the Arabian Peninsula is mainly split into a few areas. So this coast here on the west, which is next to the Red Sea, it was called Hijaz. This area is called Hijaz. Even modern day, this area is still called Hijaz. In the middle, this area here is called An-Najd. It's almost like a square. This area here is called An-Najd. And the eastern coast was called Bahrain. This eastern coast here was called Bahrain. Towards the south, which is where Yemen is today, in this area here was a huge, vast desert. As you can see on the map, it says al-Rubu' al-Khali. Al-Rubu' al-Khali means the empty quarter. Al-Khali means empty, and al-Rubu' means quarter. So it was the empty quarter, there was nothing there. It was just desert, nothing else. In fact, there was no civilization, nobody would live in the al-Rubu' al-Khali. On the edge of the Rubu' al-Khali, which is slightly north and east, was Oman, which covered this area here. Towards the south, on the southern coast, which goes towards the Gulf of Aden, was Hadramaut, which is again Hadramaut today in the modern day also, known as Hadramaut. And Yemen was the name given to the western coast of what is now known as Yemen. So again, the main population was based on the coasts, because obviously the central area, so the central area of Najd, although a few tribes had settled in Najd, many or majority of the population was focused along the coast, because obviously that's where the water is. There are no significant rivers in this whole area here. In this whole area here, there are no significant rivers. And therefore, most of the people were located in Bahrain, in Oman, in Hadramaut, in Yemen, Hijaz, and then towards the north, this then goes towards Sham and Syria and Iraq. Another important point of regarding the Arabian Peninsula was that this desert here, which is Desert al-Nafud, this went north into modern-day Syria, which is called Badiyat al-Sham. Badiyat al-Sham. This area actually starts from the top of the Arabian Peninsula, goes through Iraq, and also covers eastern part of what is modern-day Syria. This whole area was actually one desert, Badiyat al-Sham. Yes, it was controlled by different empires and some split between the Persians and the Romans, but the whole area was Badiyat al-Sham, or the desert of al-Nafud. The Arabian Peninsula, the highest point was towards the south, here towards where Yemen is, which is about 3,500 meters above sea level. So while this middle area here was basically uninhabitable, in fact it was so bad that if a storm was to come, a summer sandstorm, not only would humans die of heat and heat stroke, the camels would also die. Camels would also die. That's how powerful the storms were in these areas. And so the camel was known as the ship of the desert. It was essential to life in the Arabian Peninsula. Another thing which is important is that the climate in Yemen and the south was different to the climate towards the north. So in the north, generally the cold and the rains would come in winter, only in winter. And therefore it was dry throughout the whole year, and winter the rains would come, but again they would not be sufficient. Whereas towards the south, towards Yemen, they had more of a monsoon season. So they would have heavy rains in the summer. Now Makkah and Medina are located here in Hijaz. Makkah is here, Medina is here, which was known at that time as Yathrib. It was not known as Medina. Medina is the name given after the Prophet ﷺ then hijrah to Al-Madinah. At the time it was known as Yathrib. In fact, Makkah also had a previous name, which was Bakka. So Ta'if is towards the south, and these areas are important because obviously this was where the Prophet ﷺ initially started giving da'wah. Another important part to note here is that these states here on this side, and also Yemen here, was all under the control of the Romans of the time. So they were all satellite states and they were all Christian states. So even here in Yemen, this area here was under the control of Abraha, just before the birth of the Prophet ﷺ by a few months. And this is where we'll end today in the story of the elephants, which was the incident that took place in the year of the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, which is why it was called the year of the elephant. So Abraha was the ruler, the Christian ruler of this area of Yemen. He was not the ruler of the whole of Yemen here. Okay? Because at the time Yemen was this corner here. And so Abraha ruled this area here. He was a satellite state of the Christian states from Africa, and the Romans coming down towards Arabia. Yemen previously had been under the control of the Persians. Now if you look at it, you will say that why did the Persians come and take Yemen, come and take parts of Egypt, And yet, nobody ever came into Arabia. In this whole lesson today, we mentioned how the Persians took over Egypt, they took over Yemen, they took over Bahrain, and yet nobody ever came into Hijaz or came into the Arabian Peninsula. Does anyone have any idea why that was? Yeah, basically there were no, as the brother said, there was no need for them, there were no advantages. Yeah, so it's mainly desert. There was nothing of any value, absolutely nothing of any value. They didn't value the people, they looked at the people as people, nomads, desert dwelling tribes who would bring no benefit to their empire. Number two, there was nothing to be gained by taking over those areas. There were no ports, they had no access to the sea, they couldn't, there was not really any wealth in those areas, it's just desert. Therefore, they never even contemplated taking over the Najd or Hijaz. Now, the trade routes, I have chosen this map with trade routes, which is important because, as you can see, Yemen or Aden, the port of Aden was a very important point in the trade. So the ships would travel to Aden from the east and from the west. From the east and from the west. So it was a very critical point of international trade. And therefore the Persians had ventured far to take over Yemen because of the port of Aden. And this is also important in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So as a child, the Prophet ﷺ went on trade trips with his uncle Abu Talib. And so the Prophet ﷺ went from Makkah, he went north towards Syria, he also went towards Iraq on this side with his uncle. And this is important in Surah Al-Quraysh. Allah Azza wa Jal, He mentions regarding the Quraysh, so generally the Arabs of the time who were living there, two journeys which they used to take. What are those two journeys? So رحلة الشتاء والصيف. So they used to have a business route or a trade route in the summer and a separate route in the winter. Where did they used to go in the summer? Sorry, who said that? Down south. And in the winter? Sham. No, it's actually the other way around. They can't bear the cold, and Sham is very cold, like you've probably seen the pictures of snow falling in Sham at the moment, and in Palestine, and in Masjid al-Aqsa. The Arabs couldn't bear the cold, so they would never go to Sham in the winter. Yeah? So they would always go Sham and north in the summer, and in the winter they'd go down towards Yemen and towards the coast of Hadramaut. So these were their two main trade routes. So whatever they would buy in the south, they would then take towards the north based on the seasons, summer and winter. And these are the journeys that the Prophet ﷺ also took with his uncle from Mecca, going north towards Sham, and will cover an area in Sham which is in what we call modern day Dar'a, al-Busra, where the Prophet ﷺ met a monk, a Christian monk. In the same journey, the Prophet ﷺ also went with his uncle Abu Talib to Iraq. So this is generally the situation of the world geographically at the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. Now these maps are important, like I said, because once we start mentioning the seerah, we will have to, and the history, we will have to be referring back to these maps. And we will then go through an animation of how these maps and these areas changed during the life of the Prophet ﷺ. There is one verse in the Quran which Allah mentions regarding the Romans and the Persians. The first verse, the first few verses of Surah Al-Rum, Allah says, Alif Lam Mim, غُلِبَتِ الرُّومِ, that the Romans have been defeated. في أدنى الأرض, in a nearby land. وهم من بعد غلبهم سيغلبون في بضع سنين. That after their defeat, they will then triumph within 3 to 9 years. بضع سنين, the word بضع in the Arabic language means between 3 and 9. So Allah Azza wa Jalla said that within 3 to 9 years, the Romans will triumph again. So this is the Romans being defeated, and then they will be triumphant. لِلَّهِ الْأَمْرُ مِنْ قَبْلُ وَمِنْ بَعْدُ. That the decree belongs to Allah. When they were defeated, it belongs to Allah, and when they gain victory and will triumph, it belongs to Allah. And that day the believers will rejoice. وَيَوْمَئِذٍ يَفْرَحُ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ بِنَصْرِ اللَّهِ. That with the help of Allah, that Allah had granted victory to the Romans, and the Muslims will be happy. When the Romans were defeated, and when then they came back and they triumphed, inshallah we'll cover in next week's session. Before we close today, does anyone have any questions? No? MashaAllah. Last week, many questions. This week, not many questions. Khair, inshallah. Okay, so the brother asked, are we going to be using the Idrisi map? No, we won't be using the Idrisi map. The Idrisi map is important for us as a historical fact that this was the first major map that was accurate, that was used internationally. So many hundreds of years, the geographers would literally just copy and paste his map for hundreds of years without any change. So it's just important for us historically and in terms of Islam and the advance of Islam. But we won't be using the Idrisi map because it won't be easy for us to understand and visualize what is happening. And also it doesn't cover the whole world. And there are a few inaccuracies in the map as well. Sorry? Mosul. So Mosul of Iraq. So again, as we said, Mosul is towards the western Iraq. So this area was all covered in the area which we called Badia. And the Badia or the Naqud Desert, which covered parts of Iraq and Sham. As we said, the boundaries in those days were not like the boundaries today, drawn with a ruler and a pencil, straight lines. They were very flexible and fluid. Also, tribes used to live across borders or modern day borders. So therefore, you wouldn't say that it was specifically part of Iraq, but it was part of the general area which covered the Badia of Sham, or the desert area of Sham, and the desert area of Iraq, and the northern part of Arabia. Anything else? Okay, that's fine. Jazakumullahu khairan. To finish, we send peace and salutations upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and praise Allah Azza wa Jal. We make dua to Allah Azza wa Jal that Allahumma anfa'na bima 'allamtana. Ya Allah, grant us benefit in that which we have learned. وَعَلِّمْنَا مَا يَنْفَعُنَا, and give us that knowledge which will benefit us. وَزِدْنَا عِلْمًا وَفِقْهًا فِي الدِّينِ يا رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خيرا. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك. نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك